Okay, in terms of the stuff, deadlines remain unchangified, so exam 2, quizzes part 3, deadline April 5th, end of day. Exam 3, exam 4, quizzes part 4, April 26th, also end of day. And exam 5, final covering all things, deadlines at the end of the normal final time. And as I mentioned previously, to see if you need exam 5 or not, once you've done exams 1 through 4, as many quizzes you wish to do in the paper, you can look at your overall grade. It's not an A, then check to see, we'll get the grade estimator, put in the scores, etc. And if taking the final could improve your grade by a little grade or more, it could be worth taking. If not, it would change nothing. And again, the exam, anything you haven't done is already scored as a 0, factored in your overall grade. So if you didn't do it, it wouldn't change anything. You wouldn't get like this terrifying sudden drop. It's already there as a 0. For the paper, draft deadline April 4th, plus 5 deadline April 9th, Burns deadline for full credit April 16th, and then desperation deadline April 26th. Before pressing to the new stuff, anything about previous stuff, or stuff that needs more.
Is it 4 or 5 pages?
It's like 6 to 8, something, some number of pages.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's well, depending on how you do the pages, it's typically between 6 and 8. If you do like the normal, 250 words per page.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else? Okay, on to more Chisholm, our good dead friend. So what he's trying to do essentially is beat the skeptic. And the skeptic, of course, as we saw in the past, says, oh, you probably can't know stuff, or we seems like we don't know stuff. And Chisholm thinks there's basically 2 approaches to trying to beat the skeptic. One is what he calls Methodism, where you begin by having a method of sorting out the good from the bad. And then you apply it, and then you would have your good and things you know, things that are things that are true, things that are not true. Then the other view, the one he embraces, is particularism, where what you do is you begin by looking at what you do know, using the apple metaphor, like we know these are good apples, these are bad apples, and then you build your method from that. And he considers one problem with the Methodist approach, not the religion, but going from the method to sorting it out, is the challenge the skeptic raises, namely, how do you know your method actually works? Because if you get your method, you go and apply it. If you can't already know what's good and bad, you won't know. So what he's going to try to do is show that his particularist approach works. And this requires finding things that we know. And then addressing the skeptical challenge. The skeptical challenge always is, well, if you say you know it, then how do you know you know? And if you play that game, then it's always a losing game. It's like in the old movie War Games. The only way to win is not to play. Now, to draw, I guess, historical precedent, he turns to our good dead friend Reid. And Hume, of course, had said, he's considering the empiricist, Hume ends up in that skeptical nightmare that we saw that can only be solved by beer, which is like the scenario now would be, well, you have a sensation as if there is something here, there's a sound of a voice, and you end up like, in sort of his complete view would be, you have no reason to trust the senses, there's no reason to think that even you are a personal identity, and so you end up with this centenary, pretty much no knowledge. And Reid was critical and said, you're using the analogy that, well, a person can talk like that, but they're just kind of making it up, that they know what they're saying isn't true. Because they know that, according to him, they know they're there, they know other person's there, they know there's talking going on, and he thinks that we have all the stuff we know, and to be the skeptic is basically to, in a way, kind of be lying. And They don't know, or so he claims. Now he also turns to another dead guy, G.E. Moore, famous 20th century philosopher, dead. And Moore would say, well, yeah, if you take your hand, you know this is a hand, the skeptic knows it's a hand, and if you come across a philosophical theory that says, I don't know it's a hand, you don't know it's a hand, then that's a problem with the theory. And Chisholm thinks read Moore right, and the Methodists are wrong. Or so he claims. So kind of his, again, his strategy is he thinks the stuff we know, and we should accept that, and then we can move along, move beyond that. And I always kind of picture of someone, you're talking to a politician who's just denying like all kinds of obvious things, and you clearly know that they can't really believe what they're saying because that just can't be true. So what Chisholm sees that given his formulation, and again you can always question the formulation. Anytime there's like rules of the game, it's always fair to, instead of just saying, well, how do I win within these rules, it's always fair to ask, should these be the rules? Which is a very good question. So on his setup, and again it's the rules that he sets up, which can be, should be challenged, he says essentially you've got three possible views. Skepticism, Methodism, again not the religion, and particularism. Now for his argument to work, you would have to accept that he's right, that these are the three. Because what he's doing essentially is an argument by elimination, we've seen before. There is, of course, elimination to destruction, where you say these are the only possibilities, none of them work, so nothing. Like we saw with the skeptics. Like the skeptics would argue, you can't know by the senses, you can't know by reason, those are the only two ways, so we don't know anything. Then there's the argument to where you, by elimination, but not total elimination, kind of the Sherlock Holmes method. These are the 5 suspects, only they could have done it. These 4 are clearly innocent, the 5th person is guilty. Why, Scooby? Why did you turn against the rest of the team? So he thinks that these are the only possible options. Skepticism, Methodism, and particularism. So if you think that these aren't the only 3, and there are people who claim there's other options, then one approach would be, well, maybe there's like a 4th option, in which case his argument wouldn't handle that 4th one. Or maybe you think that there's only 1 or 2, or maybe 0 possible views. So skepticism, again, is our old friend, which is you don't know. And the skeptic, in his formulation, works this way. The skeptic, as he casts it, addresses those 2 sets of questions. One question is, going back, what do we know, and how do we decide whether we know or not? So what is known, and what are the standards of knowledge? Now, the skeptic says, you can't answer one without the other. So you end up in a circular regress. So to know what we know, they claim, you gotta have a standard of knowledge. So if I claim I know this is a hand, they'd say, how do you know that that's a hand? And then I have to give a standard. But then if I say, well, I got a standard that tells me this is a hand, they would say, well, how do you know your standard works? And so you end up in this circle. You gotta have you gotta know, you gotta separate known from not known, and you gotta have the method all at once. So running the circle. And it's a circular regress, like the job experience thing. In order to get a job, you have to have experience. In order to get experience, you have the job. If that were true, you could have a revival. And if you gotta have the method before you know what is good, and you gotta know what is good before you have the method, then you can never know anything. And so the skeptic says, aha. The skeptic accepts the questions. He says, oh yeah, those are the questions to ask. But you can't answer one without the answer to the other. And of course, then you can't answer it, because you can't answer the first without the second. You can't answer the second without the first. So, now the Methodist says you start with the method, and then you can get the answer to what do we know. So, how do we tell what's, knowledge and not knowledge? Then we take it out of the world and start sorting things, and then we get our result. And again, that's kind of the top-down approach. This also can be applied to other parts of philosophy, like in aesthetics. If you're dealing with the question, what is art? One way to approach it, this is a particular example of this, you may have a theory of art, and then you have your theory, and you go out in the world and start sorting stuff. Or you may begin with saying, this is art, that's not art, and then think, okay, what do they all have in common? There's my theory. Or also I also gave the example like in social and political structures. A person may have a theory about how the world should be, and then they go and try to make the world fit that theory, like who's supposed to be on top. Or they may look at the world as it is, and then come up with a theory that justifies or explains the way things are. So the message is saying, begin with your method, then you can figure out what you know. The particularist takes the opposite approach. They say you begin with what you know, and then you build your method. So Chisholm goes for this. So he thinks this is totally wrong. This is wrong, but at least trying to be right. And this is totally wrong. Now, even though he's a particularist, there of course can be other versions of this that he wouldn't accept. So someone else could be like, hey, I'm a particularist too, but then Chisholm could say, that their particular version of particularism could be seen as not good. Now, the classic skeptical trap is, of course, that the skeptic always would say, well, if you want to start with particulars, they always say, oh, you think you know that's a hate, you think you know you exist, or you think you can dance. Then the question they would raise is, well, how do you know? As I mentioned, that's what causes the problem. You lose by playing, by engaging. And so Chisholm thinks it's a mistake to even engage the skeptic, because as soon as you do, they've won. So it's like, hey, it's like with trolls. You're not gonna, they're just losing. Once you start talking to them, it's just losing all the way down. So he thinks that to find out whether you know such a thing, like this is a hand, you don't have to have a test or criterion. And he goes to our good dead friend Spinoza, Benedict Spinoza. Lensmaker, philosopher, survived an assassination attempt, because only a philosopher can kill another philosopher. True. Like with ninjas. Well, ninjas can kill ninjas, only philosophers can kill philosophers. They said a ninja to kill a philosopher, but that just doesn't work. It's just movie logic. Now Spinoza said, in order to know, there's no need to know that we know, much less to know that we know that we know. A lot of no's in there. Now again, the skeptic's game has always been this. If you say you know something, they always say, how do you know? If you say I know it this way, they say, how do you know that you know that you know? And they just keep raising that, how do you know that you know that you know that you know that you know? And Spinoza basically is saying, do not engage. Don't just, and when they say, well, how do you know? You just say, nothing. So, but of course, to simply say nothing would be unsatisfactory, because you kind of think, well, you just can't say something and expect people just to go, okay. So here's how he tries to answer. He claims, and he's trying to appeal to our intuitions, that there are many things that we know to be true. And he goes with sort of the examples from the Descartes rejected. Namely, if I report what I see and hear now, feel, the chances are that'll be correct, he claims. Now, then, of course, a skeptic would say, what if you're on LSD right now? Or what if you're asleep? And Chisholm, of course, can't just, he can't say, nope, that's not possible, because clearly is. And he can't say that he would know for sure, because clearly he can't. At this point, the skeptic would usually declare victory. Hallucinations, illusions, you can't know, so no. But what he does essentially is he refuses to take the Descartes option. Descartes, again, which could be his mistake, he said to know it, you got to be absolutely certain. So if you take the senses, there's never 100% certainty. You could always be wrong in a particular case. Even if it's extremely unlikely, you could be wrong. And Descartes says, his principle was, if something can't be trusted in the least, you can't trust it at all. And he believes that he doesn't have to examine all of his beliefs. He can just, reject the foundation, which would be the senses, and since it's deceived him once, he thinks he should never trust it again. And that probably is what doomed him, because he required absolute certainty, and the skeptic is right. You're probably never going to get that. But Chisholm is basically saying, okay, we can be deceived, there can be hallucinations and illusions and stuff, but the fact that our senses deceive us sometime doesn't prove that our senses deceive us now. Or so he claims. So he's sort of saying that, that Descartes made a mistake with that he shouldn't have said, oh, it fool me once. I'm never trusting anything ever again, ever. And Chisholm says, yeah, you can be mistaken, but part of the fact that I can be wrong sometime doesn't mean I'm wrong now. Now, of course, there's also the memory problem that Descartes brought up. If you're trying to do proofs, you got to remember like the steps. If you're counting, you got to remember the sides of the thing you're counting. And Chisholm says the same thing applies to memory. That your memory may have some problems, but the fact that sometimes you forget stuff doesn't mean that you're always forgetting stuff, that you're wrong now. So, in a way, he's playing kind of an interesting, perhaps dangerous game, where he is basically conceding stuff to the skeptic. The skeptic says, you could be hallucinating. He's like, yeah, totally. I was in college in the 60s, all the things we did, all those varieties of acids, the yellow, the blue, the purple, which is a color you can only see when you're in acid, when you presume. I don't know. I just made that up. I hope. There probably is such a thing. The color you can only see when you're on acid. There probably is such a color. Probably not. But maybe. Who knows? I didn't go to school in the 60s, so no familiarity with that stuff. It was just pretty much Ohio, so it was just beer and variations on beer. Like whiskey beer. Now, his objective again is he thinks that the stuff we know, and his plan is just not to start playing with the skeptic. He thinks if you grab onto that, that's going to go bad. It'd be kind of like to use a metaphor, it's like wrestling a muddy pig. The way to not get mud is you just don't touch the pig. You just don't touch it. You stay away from it. And that's what he's doing. He's like. The other people like Descartes are like, I'm going to jump in that mud pit, I'm going to wrestle that pig. He's like, wow, buddy, what a surprise. So he thinks that we have that. So essentially what he's doing is taking Descartes' meditation, the start, and instead of saying, bless you, instead of saying, oh gosh, I can't know if my senses can be trusted, he's like, yeah, I totally trust it. Now you might say he's kind of naive, maybe like someone who's constantly being tricked, like, oh, Facebook, you fooled me once, but I'm going to keep going back to you because I just can't quit you. And no one can ever truly quit Facebook. Right. It's funny as people try to go. They always read that message, I'm quitting Facebook. Like, I'll see you tomorrow.
Right, tomorrow.
Probably later today. So he thinks we now have our good apples. So using the metaphor, we know apples good out of bad apples. So we're trying to program our Applebot 10,000. It's going to go through and sort our apples. And so what we do, we go to Applebot 10,000, and we program it for what we look for in apples. Or if we're using machine learning, deep learning, we would write an algorithm that enables Applebot to like learn stuff, and then we'd show them apples, and over and over. Eventually, Applebot would get good at it. And we might not know exactly how Applebot is doing it, but the idea would be Applebot would eventually be able to sort apples as well as we can, if not better. And then it would kill us, of course, because that's how it all ends. So he thinks now that we know the apples, we can sort stuff out. And in the case of the senses, we can do that. We begin with our, contrary to Descartes. Well, they both start with the senses, and Descartes says you can't trust that. And Chisholm says, yeah, totally. Yeah, I can make them screwed up, but I totally trust them. And so now we can start building our methods. Now, he also appeals to our good dead friend, St. Augustine, not the city, but the philosopher. Interestingly, he saw the fall of Rome. So he was there when the barbarians were burning the city up. Kind of like, I guess, being in Boston after the Patriots went. Similar type of thing. Now, what's the one place where, what's the city where they always say, like, just set the city on fire every time they win?
Oh, jeez.
I think it's part of Philadelphia. It sounds like something that would happen there.
Yeah, they get wild.
Yeah, it's like, like, what are you doing? Like, they won. They're burning stuff. But, sports. Interesting. So Augustine says, more reasonable to trust the senses than to distrust them. And though there have been illusions, etc., when everything seems right, then the best thing to do is accept testimony of the senses. And this is, in a way, Chisholm was right. This is what we do. As you go through the day, you're not like sitting in your car going, I wonder if this is all real. Or like when your bills arrive, you don't hold your bill and say, I wonder if this, I wonder if this world is real and I should pay the bills with the money that's not real. And the only time that we actually are worried is cases when we do have justified doubt. So, for example, we'd use, scamming. You get a call claiming to be from the IRS, and in that case, you think, well, maybe they're not from the IRS because they say they are. And we've all experienced, visual hallucinations, non-drunk. Just everyone said this, like you think you see someone and it looks just like them until you're about, hopefully before you run up and do, hug them or something, like, oh, sorry. Yeah, oh, that was just assault. Because technically it is. You touch someone else without permission, technically assault, even if you're not trying to hurt them. Learned that definition, not because of anything I did, but because of, I was on the potential jury for an assault case, and they gave us the definition. Usually people don't push it, so if someone said, someone randomly hugged me because they thought me was someone else, they probably wouldn't prosecute.
Right.
Probably. Probably not. So we all have that experience where we see something, we think it's something else, or like from fear cases, for example. When I was in grad school, I was, of course, legally insane, as all grad students are, and one of my roommates was terrified of roaches. And so I thought, hey, this would be a good idea to terrify her. So I took a cotton ball and wrapped it with athletic tape backwards, so it would stick, covered it in brown shoe polish, and as you might imagine, it was nothing like a roach. But she had really long hair, and so I walked past her and flipped it into her hair. I said, oh my God, Tammy, there's a roach on you. And she just freaked out completely. She thought it was a roach, screaming and running around. And it's obviously not, because my other roommate's just looking at her like, why is she running around so much? She still owes me for that. I figure one day she's gonna let the interest accumulate, where it's the point where, and she's in nursing, so one day I'll be in hospital, she'll be time for revenge, and I'll get, and I'm I'll be that. And I'll totally deserve it, because that would be compound interest on that particular thing. But of course, we look nothing like a roach, but of course, she was, tricked. And we know about these cases where our perceptions just screw up. Final example, I was running at the Godfrey track, and I look up in the sky and I see a UFO, real UFO, because it was unidentified flying object. It was the classic one with a triangle with lights on the tip of each triangle. I'm like, oh great, the aliens are here. Hope they're friendly. And they brought space cake or something. And no one else on the track is panicking, so I'm like, maybe I shouldn't start screaming aliens, because I don't want to get locked up again for an alien. And then, but then as I ran around the corner, it was weird because it did. I mean, it looked UFO, black triangle, lights on the end. And then when I came around the corner, I saw it was the blimp, Goodyear blimp going to the FSU football game. And just that slight angle made all the difference. And so yeah, I was totally, deceived by this. But the fact that I, had that visual, not hallucination, but misjudgment, doesn't mean that I was like, I can't trust anything, and just lay down on the track, saying, I don't know where I am. Either that or the aliens, put their camouflage back on. You're like, oh, the human spotted us.
That's what it was.
It probably was. Turn that back on.
That's how I feel.
And aliens aren't big football fans. And that's just science. So his presumption is basically a presumption of innocence. So kind of the battle here, which I think is a reasonable approach, is who has to do the proving? Because the skeptic, in a way, you could say, they're kind of maybe cheating because they say you got to prove you know stuff, and they can just assume if you can't prove it, you don't know. And Chisholm is saying, well, the burden of proof, bless you, shouldn't be on the senses; it should be on doubt. That because it is more reasonable to trust our senses, and the cases of weird cases are pretty rare, like having misidentifying a blimp as a spaceship, mistaking someone for someone else. It does happen, but it's not like every day. It's not like you're talking to someone and you realize after an hour, wait, that's not my friend. It doesn't happen constantly. So we should regard them as reliable, unless we have some reason to think that they are mistaken, which is pretty much how we normally operate. Like when we're going around, we're not paralyzed by doubt that we're hallucinating or in a dream. It's only when something kind of odd happens, like if you see a UFO or misidentify something, or like someone says, oh yeah, that was LSD. You're going to want to sit down for a while. So I think the sense is we basically, again, assume that unless we have reason to think that they're not working, that they're working. Now again, the skeptic is would of course kind of say, well, they could be mistaken. And Chisholm says, yeah, they totally could. But he doesn't engage further. Now there's also a thing about memory. As we saw with Descartes, the way he probably gets, to doubt math and logic and stuff is anything that involves steps, you've got to remember the previous steps. And normally, our memory, as Chisholm says, our memory functions fine, so there's no problem. So the skeptic, of course, says, well, how do you know your memory is functioning fine? Now, of course, a similar thing. In general, if you think you remember something, and there's really no evidence or reasons to think you're wrong, and you have support for it, why think you're wrong? So if you're if you're working on a proof and going through the steps, you get down to the end, you check the proof again, and you're like, yeah, did that, did that modus ponens, it works. Unless there's something weird happens, like you start the proof and you wake up when your head hits the table, like, whoa, maybe I'm hallucinating or something. There'd be no reason to have doubts. And generally with memory, across the board. Now, of course, there could be cases where you might be suspicious. For example, I remember one time one of my friends was talking about this trip to Disney World we went on, and all the rides we went on and stuff. And they're telling this story, and they're kind of looking at me, and they're like, why aren't you adding anything? I'm like, that wasn't me. Like, what? I'm like, no, that wasn't me. That was somebody else. I've never been there. Like, are you sure? I'm like, yeah, I'm sure I remember that. Fortunately, there were pictures, and I was in none of the pictures. It's like, were you like not in the pictures? I'm like, no, I'm sure I was not in the pictures, but because I was not there. And so there are cases where we might be suspicious that our memory's not working perfectly. And then, of course, it never works perfectly. So the view again is, in the case of senses and memory, to say, yeah, they're probably correct unless you have a good reason to think they're not correct, that something's going on. So, this is what he thinks is his solution. You start with these particular cases of knowledge, like knows the hand, I remember stuff, and then generalize until we get what he calls the criteria of goodness. Now, one of his sort of additions here is making epistemology kind of a value theory. Because what he talks about is in terms of, you know, what it is to be epistemologically respectable. Not in the sense of like wearing, you know, fancy hat, you know, tuxedo and being dapper. But he means in terms of, you know, what would make it something we should accept. And again, he's going to kind of work it from a similar way that you look at ethics, you know, good versus bad. So the ethics analogy works like this. Now in ethics, of course, he claims, you could be wrong about this, and probably is, that when we're doing ethics, we presuppose that there's good and bad. Now, I haven't taught ethics, I'm teaching ethics this semester, in fact. There are theories that don't do that. For example, you had the ethics class, you've seen relativism, which is morality depends on the culture. And so in a way, there's no objective right and wrong, there's just what your culture accepts as right and wrong. There's also subjectivism, that there's no objective right or wrong, there's just what you accept as right or wrong. And there's also moral nihilism, which is nothing is right or wrong. There is no, when people talk about morality, it's like talking about unicorns and, you know, dragons. We got the words, but we're talking about nothing. So this analogy, even if you say, okay, it's like ethics, but you might say that, well, yeah, that's wrong. There's no objective right or wrong. So a critical assumption it makes is there's going to be objective right or wrong. But just like in ethics, even if we start with that assumption, it's good, it's bad, then we got to say what does that mean? So what he thinks we should do in the case of epistemology, he comes up with a notion, probably stealing from our good dead friend John Stuart Mill, utilitarian philosopher, went crazy, got better, and then died. Not because he went crazy, but because everyone dies. So he thinks we need this concept of right preference. So Mill, when he was doing his milling, he said that the way we tell what is morally correct is by looking at what is desirable, because morality is a science of the desirable. And Chisholm is doing a similar thing. He's saying, when you talk about right or wrong, we're talking about what is preferable. Now, by this, he doesn't mean, and he'll make this clear distinction, and it's a mistake attributed to Mill often, that with words like desirable and preferable, there's two ways they can go. Like desirable can mean able to be desired, which means the way you prove it, you just show people and say, hey, does anybody want something like this? If anyone says, yeah, it's desirable. But we also use the term desirable in another way. For example, if someone says drugs are not desirable, like heroin is not desirable, they can't mean that people don't want it. Because if the people didn't, there'd be no drug problem. There's no problem of people smacking themselves in the face with hammers. You know, we have no epidemic of hammer smacking because people don't want that. We have a heroin problem because people want heroin. And so we would say it's undesirable, not meaning that people don't want it, but they should. Same with preferable. Preferable that we're taking as people prefer it, or preferable in the sense that people should prefer it. And Chisholm is using preferable here, not what people prefer, but what people should prefer. So what he's going to try to do is work out basically the standard of preferability. In other words, what is it that you should prefer? Now, this is where he gets in the objective part. Remember, he claimed that if you're going to have a system of knowing stuff, it's got to be, immediate, and it's got to be objective, part of the three. And this is the objective part, he claims. Now, this is where he makes the distinction. It's one thing to say that one state of the mind is preferable to the other. And that would be simply, that's what you should want to have. Then there's the subjective thing where somebody prefers that to another. And a good example of this is monopolar disorder, sometimes called mania. Everyone's probably heard of bipolar disorder, sometimes called manic depression. And of course, on the depressed side, the person is depressed, they're down. There's also a monopolar disorder where someone is just depressed. They don't get the manic part, they just get the depressed part. And although it's controversial in psychology, there is the view that just as you have depression by itself, you can also have mania by itself. And there are people who apparently do have they just have mania. They're not always happy, but they never get to the depression part. Now, when someone's in this mania, assuming it's a thing, that is a state they prefer. Why? Well, according to people who've had this, everything feels awesome, just amazing. Everything is meaningful and significant and great. Even the most unpleasant things. For example, one of the people who says they have mania, and no reason to doubt them, when they were in school, the mania was making so they couldn't function. They felt fine, and her father came and got her, and she escaped and ran out to this field. It was out there, this cornfield, and the police came and they said, just go home. And she's like, no, arrest me. And they're like, we don't want to arrest you, which I can say, but they're like, we don't want to arrest you. And she's like, no, arrest me. And they're like, okay. So they arrest her, and then she's just acting, crazy in the jail cell, literally, in mania, and they pepper sprayed her and maced her. She said it was wonderful. Being maced was, and she just super enjoyed being maced because everything is wonderful. So with mania, people have these incredible feelings of, they feel elation, they feel incredibly creative, and everything is just super positive. Nothing is awful. On one hand, that'd be super appealing. Imagine going through your whole day where every single thing is just awesome. Like your bagel, you get cut off in traffic, that was awesome. You get a huge bill you can't pay, awesome. And you feel great about everything. And you feel super creative and you're seeing connections everywhere. That'd be super great. And of course people would prefer that. Of course the thing is, from the inside, it seems like super, super awesome. But then from the outside, it's just a nightmare. Because the person, can't function, they're not able to keep their job, they're able to interact with people, and they see, it's like those, the memes where they have what my parents think I do, what my friends think I do, what I actually do. Yeah, it's kind of like that. So the person, what I think I'm doing, they would have a picture of Captain Marvel or Gandalf or something, being all awesome. And then what other people see would be someone laying in a ditch, twitching, which would be kind of what it's like. But really loving that. And so you would say in that case that state in one way is preferable. People have this mania say it's just amazing when they're in it. But when they look at it, from the standpoint of the people, objectively, they realize that it's terrible. It's just terrible on everyone else. And so that's a pretty good, it's not Chisholm's illustration, but it does nicely illustrate this. What we could say is preferable, objectively, we would say that being manic is not preferable, but people could prefer it. Or you can use a state of being super high. People are high, they want to get more high and stay high. But we would say objectively that's not a good state to be in. Now, of course, he's got to kind of cash this up. And one thing that philosophers do that most non-philosophers, actually all non-philosophers, and most philosophers find annoying, is you got to symbolize stuff. Now, one reason why philosophers do this is a good reason. One thing is, like, when you're trying to, like, compare things, and you start, like, using vague pronouns, like, you know, one thing and another, it's easy to get sort of, like, which things are you, it's the pronoun game, which things are you comparing? And so one reason to do it is you gotta, like, talk about, like, which one you're talking, you know, comparing things. And you can't, like, call them, like, names, I guess, one of them. Sometimes people do, like, let's call this one Sally, that one, you know, Raphael. There we go, Sally, Raphael. What philosophers typically do is they like to use just variables. And one reason they do this is because it makes it seem like math. You know, so, like, we're doing, like, real sciencey stuff. And it can get kind of annoying, because sometimes people will take it too far. They're like a sentence you can just say normally, and everyone knows, remember, they'll just, like, put all this stuff, and you're like, why are you doing that? It's probably some sort of mental illness philosopher or something. It's like, I can't help it. I just got to say things like that. So in this case, I think he's just trying to, you know, he's not going crazy. He's just trying to be, like, clear. So if we have one state of mind, A, to be referred to another state of mind, B, it is intrinsically preferable to B, then anyone who prefers B to A is mistaken. Or you can put this, maybe it is being a little crazy, because you get to say, if A is preferable to B, then anyone who prefers B to A is wrong, basically. Which, in a way, a fancy way of saying is, if something is objectively better, if you pick the other one, you're wrong. So I guess you could have said that much clearer without the A's and the B's, so I take that part back. Now, this, even though it doesn't credit Mill here, he does mention the ethics part. If you had the ethics class or at Mill, Mill is a very similar thing, because what he has to do, he's talking about, like, pleasure is the highest good, and then there's a classic thing called the pig objection, where people say, hey, if pleasure is the highest good, then the raw animal physical pleasures would be the highest ones. But that life would be, you know, a terrible life, because then it'd be like heroin would be the best thing, because it's, you know, super intense. And what Mill would do is say, well, there are certain pleasures that are preferable to others, and the way he argues it is that if you gave people, you know, who understood both a choice between them, they would pick the higher over the lower. So if you had someone who, like, understood heroin and friendship, they would still pick friendship, you know, if they weren't, like, already addicted, or so he claims. And so Chisholm is kind of wrong with here. He's saying that you go by we're kind of doing it by the preferences, but he's trying to do it objective as well. And that creates a bit of a challenge. You know, how do you have preferences and talk about being objectively preferable? And then going back to the Manning example, we might say from our perspective, you know, on the outside, if you have, like, you know, a friend or a child or a spouse, you know, boyfriend, girlfriend, or whatever, that's manic. Yeah, it's horrible for you, but from their standpoint, it's awesome. So then it's a fair question of who is, I mean, true, it is terrible for you, but it's great for them. So how do you say which one is actually preferable? All you can really say is, it'd be preferable to me if they weren't doing that. I didn't have to go and find them in some cornfield at 2 a.m. dancing with the cows again. But from their standpoint, you know, being that may be great. You know, dancing with the cows at 2 a.m. is, you know, it's awesome. But Chisholm thinks he's mostly kind of got it. So what he needs here, of course, is a theory of evidence, because he's trying to build that criteria. So again, he thinks, okay, when I'm seeing stuff, hearing stuff, I'm probably right. When I'm remembering stuff, probably right. Unless there's something that tells me, you know, like, gives me indication otherwise, like weird stuff is going on. So what he needs to do is lay out this theory of evidence. And again, he does it, this is really popular in philosophy, especially epistemology. I remember when I was in grad school, the first class I had to take was epistemology, theory of knowledge. And then I thought epistemology meant, you know, boring to death. The class was, well, this is how it went. Everyone had to take it. And everyone would be sitting there, like the first day we're all kind of excited, because we're all new in grad school. And then pretty soon people are just kind of like, literally nodding off. You'd hear people, like sometimes people would fall over and whack their head on the table, but they wouldn't wake up because they were so bored. And then gradually you saw like people were bringing like ever stronger caffeinated beverages. People started with like Coke, and it goes to like Jolt. And then people are pouring Jolt in coffee. Then they're pouring espresso into more espresso. And they're just chewing coffee beans to stay awake. And the professors, as a joke, gave us like this fake exam that was impossible to do. But it had all the stuff like, you know, like basically we're like A is beyond reasonability, blah, 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 blah. And we didn't realize it was a joke. That was the thing, it's like, don't you realize none of these can be done? It's a joke. And we're just like, it just seems just like the rest of the class.
It's like, what's going on?
Yeah, and I was like, I'll never need, mental note, never make a test, never make a class like that where the impossible test seems just normal. Just like that, yeah. So one thing that again is kind of unfortunate that philosophers do is they do tend to do a lot of this kind of stuff. Now again, the good part about it is if you're trying to be like clear, which is why people in math use, you know, symbols in case to be clear, so it's easier just to put out a symbol and show what you mean. But I think many times philosophers kind of overdo it, and it actually becomes, you know, less clear. And when people read it, they're like, what? But this is what he claims. He's trying to build this theory of evidence. So, for example, a proposition P is beyond reasonable doubt, provided only that believing P is then epistemically preferable for S to withholding P. Now, in many cases, this can be translated to more normal English to be maybe more appealing. So what he seems to be saying is this. A statement will be beyond reasonable doubt when believing it is preferable to not believing it. So I guess that was easier. Now, the withholding P, he claims is, and this is something, again, kind of the third option people often forget about. Whenever I teach a critical thinking class, I always make a point of critical thinking is not just knowing when or rationally accepting and rejecting claims, it's also knowing when to say, I don't know, to suspend judgment. And we often forget that. It's not just, we don't have to believe or reject everything, we can fairly say, don't know. So withholding for him is, well, basically the state of suspending judgment, which he lays out kind of needlessly complicated way of you don't accept, neither accepting it nor its negation. Or put more plainly, withholding is just suspending judgment. You don't buy, you don't reject it. Now he continues to present, again, additional sort of attempts at his theory of evidence. Because again, what he wants to do is go from, yeah, we can trust our senses, we can trust our memory, but then what do we use as a general method, a general system of sorting stuff out? And here's where he tries to build that sorting. So, like many of the previous dead philosophers we looked at, he tries to begin with what is evident. We saw this with like Descartes and Leibniz and others. And things that are evident are supposed to be such that, the normal common sense view, if you understand it, you just see that it's true. You don't have to go through any process of assessment. It's just, I get this, I see the truth. And the problem has always been, namely, how do you know when you're seeing the truth and when you're just like super enthusiastic, having a stroke, tripping out on LSD? How do you know? Which is a fair point. So he's trying to solve that problem. This is what he claims. For a claim to be evident to a person, he says, estimate these conditions. One, beyond reasonable doubt. And of course, that also needs to be defined. What doubts would be reasonable? Because depending on your view, what's reasonable can vary quite a bit. For example, I love conspiracy theories. Not that I have any of my own, I actually have lots. But there are many cases unless the person's going and shooting people, which sometimes happens, that's when they stop being fun. But often they're very enjoyable because it's interesting to see how people craft these elaborate explanations of things. And if you ever listened to, read, or heard people YouTubing conspiracy theories, what is beyond reasonable doubt for people can vary quite a bit. And if you see someone talking about a conspiracy, for example, that 9/11 was an inside job, That's a popular one. That the moon landings were faked by NASA, another popular one. And then there are ones that are definitely not fun. The various, racist ones, that the Jews are secretly controlling the world. And when people make these claims, in some cases maybe they're just lying, they're just trying to mess with people, troll people. But in some cases they seem quite sincere. So things that would be wacky conspiracy theories to pretty much everyone else, they see as beyond a reasonable doubt. So you run into that problem, what do we mean by reasonable doubt? Like for me, I have no doubt that the moon landings really occurred. Because if you go through the science of it and the sociology of it, why would how could that be pulled off? And why would the Russians and so forth just go along with us, just lie and say, oh yeah, the Americans went there, they went to the moon, totally true. But to other people, it is a reasonable thing they can doubt. So that's kind of a problem there. But he claims it's evident means it's beyond reasonable doubt, with the obvious problem, what does that mean? And he claims that if you include it among all the propositions upon which you base your decisions, it's preferable to do so as opposed to not including it. So what does that mean? Well, basically in normal terms, what he'd say is this. So you want to know, is this evident for you? Chisholm says, is it beyond reasonable doubt for you? If the answer is yes, check. Secondly, would you, if you had a choice, would you put it in with all the other things you use to make your decisions, or would you not? If the answer is yes, it goes in the decision bucket, then evident, or so he claims. So that's his definition of evident, beyond reasonable doubt, and it goes in your decision bucket rather than not being in your decision bucket. Now again, one problem with this, and Chisholm might say, well, these are just weird cases. Again, think of a conspiracy theorist, someone who's convinced that NASA faked the moon landing, or that the Jews are behind controlling all of the world. To them, assuming they aren't just trolling, they believe this beyond a reasonable doubt, and it goes in their decision bucket. And you might say, well, they're crazy conspiracy theorists, but again, in this case, this does raise the question of, well, how would you kind of work it out so that crazy conspiracy theorists, don't have this supposed knowledge? But Chisholm will try to sort that out a bit. So what about it being acceptable or unacceptable? Well, this part is pretty easy. A claim to be acceptable just means believing it is preferable to not believing it. Unacceptable just means that not believing it, suspended judgment, is preferable to believing it. And so these both seem correct. Now again, kind of the problem he faces is, how do you get this to be objective? Because yeah, it's true, something's acceptable to me if I prefer to not having it. Something is unacceptable if I prefer not to have it. So, for example, having a dog is acceptable to me because I want to have a dog as opposed to not dog. Having a Komodo dragon in my house, not acceptable. So I don't want to have Komodo dragon. I make terrible pets. Because they have really bad taste in movies and music. So I'm always listening to terrible music and watching bad shows. Plus their saliva is full of bacteria. If they bite you, you probably die. That is also bad. Now, and he continues to try to sort through this sorting theory. So some propositions don't hit the standard of beyond reasonable doubt. But, obviously true. And of course, as also is obviously true, they may have some presumption in their favor. So, you can take examples from normal everyday life. For example, you could say in politics, it's not beyond reasonable doubt that most politicians are, up to something, but, there's some presumption in favor that they probably So how does he define this in his complicated way? Well, he claims, put in normal terms, is that if it's got presumption in its favor, then you would prefer believing it than not believing it, which seems reasonable. So what would be for someone to be absolutely certain? Because again, what he's trying to get to in a way is, he's still operating within kind of the normal, framework. You gotta have truths that are like evident and certain, and then you gotta have stuff that's less so. So he tries to work in absolute certainty, but of course, he wants to avoid the problem of the skeptic, because the skeptic can always say, oh, are you really absolutely certain? So here's what he tries to do. First, to be absolutely certain, and he defines it relative to a particular person at a particular time. So suppose you're wondering, am I certain about this? Or someone asks you, are you certain? Do you really want to watch that terrible, terrible movie? And here's how you know. Well, here's how you go through the process. First is, the proposition has got to be evident, which takes us back to that previous definition. Secondly, there's got to be no other claim, proposition, such that believing in the other one is preferable to believing to that one. Put this way, basically the idea is, it's evident to you, and there's no other alternative that you want. So if using the movie metaphor, it would be, there's no other movie you want to watch more than that one. A terrible, terrible movie. Thirdly, he thinks that this concept can be axiomatized and made the basis of a system of epistemic logic, which will sort this all out. So his claim is, he thinks he can take this and build, the system. I mean, in modern parlance, an algorithm that we could use to sort this stuff all out. Now, he doesn't claim in this relatively short paper to have, solved all the stuff. So he doesn't have a complete theory here. But he thinks what we can do, and he's kind of like pointing to what he thinks we can do, is we could build up the system where we would be able to sort out, things that are certain, things that are evident, and then know stuff. Now again, going with kind of the modern algorithm metaphor, if we wanted to build, suppose we wanted to build a machine that does this for us, what we would do using Chisholm's approach, and the approach they actually use now, is we would take things we know, or things we think we know, and we'd have our learning machine, and we'd show him that stuff, and then have it sort stuff. And then every time he gets it, have a feedback thing, so when he gets it right, it gets a, well, I don't want to say it knows that, but it's informed when it's right and when it's wrong. And then it would develop a system for doing all this sorting. And Chisholm thinks we could do this. We could build a system, what he calls epistemic logic, that will sort this stuff out for us, and then we can know stuff. I guess he ran out of, well, actually he died, so he just never got around to doing it. Because unfortunately, we don't have that system. One that's been kind of problematic about philosophers is people like Leibniz, et cetera, they do promise these things and say we could do this, but you generally don't see it delivered by philosophers. Of course, you can make a reasonable point is when it gets to the actual engineering and science stage, that it's no longer philosophy and science and engineering. So in a way, even though Leibniz didn't deliver, people are still working on his project. Like every time we get the weather prediction machines, our algorithms, are Leibniz's project. So we don't call it philosophy now, we call it meteorology, but back when it was conceptual it was. So maybe someday, they'll have that on Facebook, because they're claiming they're worried about fake news, and they want a system to sort out fake news and real news, which is this problem. How do you know what's fake? How do you know what's real? And you got to train the algorithms to sort it out. And maybe someday Facebook will solve that problem. You just type something in Facebook, and it'll tell you whether it's true or not, based on how much money Zuckerberg made from it. Maybe that'll be the standard.
Right.
Doesn't make bucks for Zuck. If so, true. If not, false. Zucker epistemology. Could be a thing. that's terrible. Oh, yeah, I did fix that. I just had a bad slide. Second. What I do is when I do the sliding, I put it in the notes and then adjust it. That one apparently just didn't get deleted. All the stuff is there, just make sure all the stuff is still there, but the laziness of copy paste. So what types of immediately evident propositions do we have? Now, again, he's trying to recreate the stuff we saw previously, namely what kind of things are immediately evident, etc. So he goes back to our good dead friend Leibniz. And Leibniz claimed there are two immediately evident propositions. Because what Chisholm to make it work has got to have things where you just go, yep, know that. And the skeptic says, but, you say, say anything to the skeptic because you don't want to talk to that person. And so Leibniz had two types of things that are immediately evident, namely first truths of fact, which would be things about the world, but they have the feature of as soon as you understand them, you know they're true. And also, of course, first truths of reason, which is also, they're not about the world, so to speak, but as soon as you know them, you know they're true. So what are the first truths of facts? Well, this also takes us back to our good dead friend Descartes. Descartes believed that the one thing he knew for sure was that he thinks he is. So he has a mental state, so there's got to be that state. And now even our good dead friend David Hume, he believed that even though you can't know that you have a self that exists, very Buddha-like, there is no self, that he believed that you could know that you were having a perception at this time. So even though you couldn't know like you were perceiving a backpack, you could say I'm having a perception of this type of this moment, or there is a perception of this at this moment. So for Chisholm, the first truths of facts are these. Type 1, your own mind at the time, namely thinking certain thoughts, entertaining certain beliefs, I guess having them over for some salts and chips, I guess that's how that works, and being in a certain sensory emotional state. So for example, it'd be, I'm thinking of looking at a slide, I believe it's a slide, and this slide makes me sad, or however you feel about the slide. Maybe it makes you happy, but probably neutral. I went for like kind of neutral, with the neutral colors. Don't want happy slides, don't want slides that are too sad, or too happy. Secondly, these propositions all pertain to certain states that manifest or present themselves to the person at the time. So first truths of facts would be, what people like Hume and Descartes and Leibniz would agree, there is a thought, there is a belief, there is happiness, there is sadness. And he thinks those are all things you can know. Now, does that seem reasonable? When you're happy, do you know it? Well, I would hope so. And then, of course, one would clap one's hands. Someone does. Yeah, and so this seems to be intuitively plausible. Descartes said, I think I am. Yeah, sure. I believe. Yeah. Feeling. Yeah. So maybe he's right about that. Does seem appealing. So that takes care of the first truths of fact. And they're truths of fact because they're not like logical truths. That I'm thinking about something, a logical truth, or that I'm happy, neutral, not logical truths. So what about the other type? Well, the other type, of course, would be such that you know them from the logic. So how do we know these non-logic types? Well, he also uses our good dead friend Maimon, which is an interesting name. And he claimed that certain states are self-presented. Namely, if you're in that state, then it's necessary that it is evident to you that you're in that state. put in normal English, basically what it means is this. A self-presenting state is such that if it is evident to you you're in the state, you're in the state. And if you're in the state, then it's going to be evident to you. In other words, being in the state, you just know it. And knowing it, you know you're in the state. What they have going, to use a metaphor, is they present themselves and they are the marks of their own evidence. It'd be kind of like, to use a metaphor, it'd be kind of like, instead of having like an ID, you are proof that you are you, just yourself. You'd be like going to like check in the airport, and the person just looks at you and says, yes, you are you. Proceed. It doesn't need any ID. Yeah, so with metaphor, these would be states you don't have to have an ID on them to know what they are. You just know what they are because of what they are. They bear the mark of their own evidence. No ID needed. And it's always weird, if you go someplace and you know the person. I know some people in TSA, they still check my ID though. So I'm like, hi Mark, how are you doing? Like, oh, hi Mike, can I see your ID? I'm like, of course. He looks at it, looks at me, looks at it, looks at me. Or similarly, it's when I was getting my surgery, get my leg reattached. The person checking me was, a new graduate. She said, oh, hi, Professor LaBossiere. I'm like, hi, how are you doing? She's like, oh, can I see your ID? Of course. It's like, oh, they got to do their job because I could be, pretending to be someone I'm not. To go get that sweet surgery. So, as he sees it, you can't have them unless it's evident they occur. So there's no way they could happen without you knowing, or so it claims. And he quotes from St. Thomas, the intellect knows that it possesses the truth by reflecting on itself. And so, boiling this all down, he thinks there are certain, beliefs we have, states we have, where if you got them, you know they're true. And they just show the truth to you. I can use the metaphor. It's like you know the person, and so you don't have to see their ID. They just self-credential, as opposed to having to check the ID. So then we turn to the first truths of reason. And again, just, he's sticking with kind of the conventional approach. There's truths of fact, truths of reason. Now, as we saw repeatedly, these are the a priori truths. You know them before experience. They're also supposed to be necessary truths. So they're true, and they're true always and true everywhere. So again, going back to the sci-fi example, if you were doing, trans-world exploration, there are some things you have to check, like in Galaxy Quest. Is there air? You don't know until you check. But some things, if they're necessary truths, you wouldn't have to check. You wouldn't have to go and try to draw a triangle to make sure that still worked. That'd be kind of weird. You're trying to draw a triangle. It's like, I can't draw triangles. It's like, oh God, what's going on? So they're all necessary. Now, our good dead friend, the Scholastics, from which we get our term, scholastics, and they were a philosophical school called the Scholastics. They got going under Charlemagne the Great when he funded the university systems, being a great leader. He realized education is important. You should fund schools. And he funded and created many of the great universities in Europe, which are still around today. And the academic tradition that arose around that were the Scholastics. And hence we get our term scholar and scholastics. It goes back to the Middle Ages. And the Scholastics, who liked Latin, said it was evident ex terminus. Which is, I guess, kind of a cool term. Which is that as soon as you understand the term, you see the truth. And the usual examples, of course, hold here, like bachelor, unmarried man. So as soon as you understand unmarried man as bachelor, you see the bachelors are all married. Similarly, as soon as you understand triangles are three-sided, you know triangles are always three-sided. You don't have to go and check. And going back to Hume, the idea is that the ideas have this connection. And Hume called them, of course, relations of ideas. And St. Thomas said, propositions that are manifest through themselves. Now, Chisholm wants to call these axioms, taking, of course, from the math and the logic. So an axiom is a necessary proposition that you can't understand without knowing it's true. So basically, to know it is to understand that it is to know it's true. So as soon as you know what it means, you go, well, that's true. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas believed in these. Now, one of the problems that always arises from these is the examples people use. You know, it makes sense, okay, as soon as you understand it, you know it's true. Now, in some cases, it does seem to fit. Once you understand that triangles have three sides, you know it's true triangles have three sides by definition. Now, sometimes people like to put in things where they think they're like this, but other people may not. For example, I believe one example from Aquinas was that angels don't take up space, they're corporeal. And he said, well, once you understand angel, you understand they don't take up space. And then, of course, I would say, well, maybe they don't have a different conception of angel. Because there was you probably heard the medieval puzzle, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. It was a thing. It's often used today as kind of a mocking point, like if you want to say that someone's working on kind of a problem that's totally like frivolous and abstract, you can say you're trying to figure out how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. The solution, of course, is you take the size of angels and divide that by the number of head of a pin. But if angels are corporeal, have no physical body, the number is infinite, because you can fit an infinite number of them anyway. And of course, there are people who think that certain moral views are this. Once you understand the moral term, you therefore know it's true. But then, of course, it clearly doesn't seem to work, because otherwise you just say, here, and people go, oh yeah, now I know all the good. Unless, of course, they don't really understand it. Because Socrates said, to know the good is to do the good. And so people who aren't doing good, it's a lack of understanding. They don't, if they truly knew the good, they would do it. And so I guess you could make the point that people who don't get it, they don't really understand it. They think they do, but they don't. If they did, they would accept it or do the good. So for Chisholm, a proposition would be axiomatic and again, he makes it all about the subject, for a person at a particular time, if this. One, necessarily true, and it is necessarily true the person believes the proposition is evident to them. Which is a fancy way of saying what was said before, namely, to be axiomatic is necessarily true, so always true, can never not be true, and weirdly, it's also necessarily true if the person believes it, then it's evident to them. They simply believing it, it's simply evident to them. Which in a way is a long way of saying what was said by other people. So that's how he thinks that works out. And so time is ended, not all times, it's class time. And so next time we'll pick up with more stuff on the Tuesday. So have a good rest of the week. And I'll see you all on the Tuesday.